everyone, and welcome to another episode of In the Reading Corner. I'm Nikki Gamble, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome back Kwame Alexander, poet, novelist, educator, and I believe film producer now, and general inspirer. We're going to be talking about two very important books, the new verse novel, The Door of No Return, and a picture book published here in the UK as Unspoken, but in America as An American Story. It's illustrated by Dare Coulter. Both books are published in the UK by Anderson Press. There are lots of points of connection between the novel and the picture book, but I'd like to begin with The Door of No Return. This incredible story triggered every emotion for me. I'd like to say that I read it in one sitting, but in truth, I had to pause partway through to process and gather strength to read the second part. It's set in Ghana in 1860, and the protagonist is a young boy, Kofi, who's in that transition phase between childhood and becoming a man. He's a dreamer and a lover of story, and he's in love, captivated, smitten. He's a noticer of his environment too, and he finds meaning and expression through swimming. I wondered if we could start with Kofi. I've given him a brief description, but how else should we introduce him to our listeners?
He's a boy who's got a crush on a girl, and he's got a cousin who has a crush on the same girl, and his cousin's a bully, and he's tired of his cousin picking on him, and he feels like, I've got to do something to win my pride back. And he's got homework, and he doesn't particularly care for his teacher, and he loves a dish called red, which is like this bean stew. But his older brother eats all the red, so he never gets a second helping. I would describe Kofi as this kid, this boy, this regular kid who's growing up, trying to figure out how to just enjoy life, go to the river for a swim, hang out with his best friend, Ebo. And I like to say that we often forget that people of African descent are human beings. We tend to define people of African descent by the tragic things that have happened to us. And I posit that that's not the best way to approach it. So I wrote this book and tried to create this character of Kofi to remind us that we're just people who are going on about our lives, laughing, loving, hoping, swimming, eating, dancing, thinking, dreaming, living, just like everybody else.
So there are lots of things that young readers will recognise from his life that make connections with their lives, even though they're living in the here and now, in the 21st century, wherever they may be. Your novel, though, is historical, and it's set in Ghana in the 1860s. And I think we should pause for a moment to think about both place and time. Let's start with Ghana. I know that you have been there. I'm interested to know what took you there and what you learnt about Ghana from those visits.
Well, I went to Ghana for the first time in 2012 with a friend of mine who was to become the queen mother of a village. And the queen mother is someone appointed by the king to handle and manage the social, health, education, welfare of the women and children in a village. So my friend was to become the queen mother, and she wanted me to come and document the trip. And I remember going for the first time and being just knocked out by the oppressive heat. Oh, and being in this village in the eastern region of Ghana and seeing what I thought through my Western eyes was abject poverty, and then meeting these children and families whose eyes were filled with so much hope and ambition and love. And I just thought, man, somebody's going to write a story about these people one day and talk about how poor they were, but that's not really the story.
People make huge assumptions about what poverty is.
Right. They were rich in heart and soul and spirit and culture and community. All those kind of things that I find that in America we're missing. So what struck me the most was the joy and just the spirit of positivity in the eyes of these kids. And I sort of said to myself, I want to do something in this village to help these young people not only have hope and dreams, but they can have tools to actualize those dreams. And so one of the things I decided to do was build a library, because I believe in the power of words to transform our lives. I know the role literature and language has played in my life. And so I thought, well, maybe I can offer something to this community in the form of a library, which is sort of a house of dreams, a house of possibility. And maybe I can open up a world of possibility. And so that was sort of the beginning of my journey in Africa in general and in Ghana in particular. And I went back 10 more times after that over the next 8 years. And we did get the library built, and we built a health clinic as well.
Did any of the people that you met on your visits to Ghana influence the characters in your story?
Many of the people that I met in Ghana got to befriend and spend time with. They certainly influenced and inspired the Door of No Return's characters and setting. Mm-hmm. You know, I got to walk the land that Kofi walks. Mm-hmm. I got to eat red, which is my favorite dish. I got to do many of those things that found their way in this book. So certainly those 11 visits to Ghana played a huge role directly and indirectly.
When you were there, did you get to take part in the Full Circle Festival?
Oh, yeah. I participated in so many festivals while I was there. And so that gave me a frame of reference for the festival that I wrote about in the book. I saw wrestling, I saw dancing, I saw parades, I saw feasts, I saw kings being carried around, I saw the beautiful outfits, the dresses. And I had no idea at the time that I was doing research for a book. I was just sort of living it, being in it, and being present. And so years later, when I would write The Door of No Return, all of those things came back to me, and I was able to go back and use my memory to inform the story.
It is called The Door of No Return. So on one level, we know where this story is taking us. But of course, that title can be used to mean many different things. And in a sense, it's ironic because there is a return. There's a sense in which you are returning to Ghana. Maybe there's a sense in which there is return for the characters in this story too, although I don't really want to go into that in too much detail. It's set in the 1860s, and that struck me just how recent this history is. So tell us about the Ghana of the 1860s.
Well, the Ghana of the 1860s was this nation that had been ping-ponged between these various European powers who were trying to own the culture, the gold, the palm, the people, from the Portuguese to the Dutch to the British. And so you have this country that is trying to figure out its identity in the midst of having been brutalized, in the midst of having, millions of its citizens stolen and taken away, in the midst of having families broken apart, in the midst of their whole just sort of infrastructure just being crushed, and on the verge of this country becoming an official colony of Great Britain. And so it was certainly a country in the midst of a lot of turmoil and a lot of chaos and wars between tribes, between the Ashanti and the Fanti. That stuff is pretty well-known history, but I thought, well, what about the kids? Like, what was happening to the children? What were their lives like during this time? And of course, I wasn't there. I could only imagine. But it did occur to me that in times of great horror and terror, the mothers and the fathers, their goal still remains the same as it relates to their families, to protect their kids, keep their children hopeful, and to not totally destroy whatever ideas their children have of a life. And so I tried to write this book from the vantage point of a child in the midst of the turmoil and the chaos that's happening across this great nation, and still having some bit of normalcy. I found out later in life that my father, who was a revolutionary and an activist during the civil rights movement, he received death threats. As a child, you don't really know about that stuff. You're just going to baseball practice or you're hanging out with your friends. And so parents have this way of being able to protect their children from the atrocities of life. And I wanted to write that story in The Door of No Return. And of course, at a certain point in the story, those atrocities, it's going to be hard to avoid them now. So that was sort of the Ghana that I wanted to write about. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea that slavery had been abolished 30 years prior, but there were still people who were illegally kidnapping and stealing Africans and attempting to enslave them. I think the last slave ship may have docked in Alabama. I think it's called the Clotilda, and it was 1861, maybe 1862. So I wanted to play around with that as well.
I mean, that date felt very significant for that reason. A, it's late, but also 1861 to 1865, we know, is also the American Civil War.
Right.
There's this fantastic character in the book. It's the grandfather, Nanamosi, the storyteller. And his first story starts, "There was even a time," is how my papa's father, Nanamosi, the village storyteller, begins most of his fireside tales, always starting in the middle of a thought, like we know what even came before. That's right at the heart of what this story is, that we need to know what happens before.
Yeah, I mean, we have this idea that Black history or the history of Black people starts around slavery, and that we begin to define Black people by this very tragic thing that happened to us. And I think that adds to our unimaginative perspectives on Blackness, on Black people. I posit that slavery was not our beginning. It was a middle. And so let's go back and look at a beginning. Let's embrace the full humanity of Black peoples. And I think the way that I chose to do that was by looking at a child who, before all of these things that we have learned about in history books, began to occur. Yeah, those beginnings are really important to me. I wanted to change the narrative a little bit.
Nanamosi has lots of proverbs too, and I wondered whether he was partly you, this very wise man.
No, it was like my grandfather, my father, my grandmother, my uncles. Growing up, I used to hear a lot of different proverbs or sayings from the elders in my life. You can't know what you don't know. Dishwater gives back no images. Like, I would hear so many different things and I would try to decipher them. Like, what does that mean? So that was sort of my nod to that. That goes back ages and ages in terms of how generations pass down wisdom to their children and to their grandchildren. A great deal of that comes through proverbs and poems and axioms and songs.
I wonder whether we could talk a little bit about what is an important recurring motif in the story, the idea of swimming and water. At the beginning, it says, "Our waters can take you to other places, other wonderful worlds." It has both positive and negative connotations in the story, but swimming is Kofi's sport. He learns lots of different ways of swimming, honing his skill and his craft through this novel.
The water is a very symbolic thing for peoples of African descent. And I don't know how it is in Britain, but in America, I would say you ask the average Black person if they swim, and many of them would tell you no. And some of them would tell you they're not going anywhere near the water. There's sort of this ancestral memory about the water and all of the terrible things that have been associated with it. One of my theories is that when Africans were stolen from their home and they were put on these large wooden ships and they were taken out to sea, at a certain point, they looked back and they could no longer see their homes. And they looked forward and they couldn't see anything. The only thing they saw was the sky and the sea, both of them being blue. And so when you talk about the blues, I posit that it comes out of that feeling of not knowing where you're headed or what awaits you when you get there. And the only thing you have that's sort of guiding you is this water, which many people jumped into the jaws of sharks because they didn't want to see what awaited them. They knew what they were dealing with on these ships and what they had dealt with in these slave castles. And so it couldn't be good. And so they'd rather jump. So I posit that maybe that's where the blues come from. But if you think about it, that's a lot, that ancestral memory, that stress, that tragedy, that's a lot to deal with. But in my research, I found that there were quite a few cultures, in particular fishing communities, where people swam in West Africa. And you think about it, if you have a traditional fishing community and you're going out to sea, a conventional wisdom says you're going to have to know how to swim at some point, lest you fall over and you drown. And so once I sort of figured out that there was a swimming culture, I've written books about basketball, about football, about baseball. I said, well, this is going to be my swimming book. Swimming is going to be the metaphor in this story. And it's going to be the thing that ultimately perhaps saves our main character.
Lots of different techniques he tries out for swimming. At one point, it talks about him swimming like a sea snake, moving his legs from side to side. And then he learns to swim, keeping his head under the water. I think it's Amma that tells him he'll go faster if he keeps his head down. Did this come out of your research, or were you just imagining the different things that he might have tried as a keen swimmer?
Yeah, definitely a little bit of both. Just using my imagination, which was certainly spawned by a lot of the research that I did on swimming. The big rock. There is a big place far out away from people watching where the water is crystal clear. It streams smooth and steady. This is where I go to swim and think. I leap into the river from a tree, head following, feet bouncing, barely breaking the surface, arms flapping with the flow, the whole of me gliding toward the middle of the river. When I get to the big rock, I flip around and swim back. On my third trek, I float in the current, stare at the copper sky, think about Amma's scent and her smile, then float away, letting the current carry me, letting the warmth of the fading sun bathe me as I watch it completely disappear like a dream. I just tried to really imagine myself in the water swimming. I even went to the beach a couple times and just sort of documented in my mind, what am I doing? What is each step that I'm taking? How can I translate that onto the page and still get that image without it being didactic?
There's another verse about swimming entitled Flow, which I absolutely loved. We use the expression finding your stroke, and that's exactly what Kofi is doing here, finding his stroke. Like a black eagle, tightly gripping the current with each stroke of my arms, kicking my legs in sync and thinking about nothing but the flow. Is writing like that?
It's just like that. When I'm writing those swimming scenes, I'm writing in the moment and trying to make sure this particular poem speaks to that moment, but I'm also writing in a crescendo. So I'm writing to get to a point. And when the writing gets really good, when you really find your stroke, you know that when you get to that final lap, it's all going to come together. And all the little seeds you planted along the way, I'm mixing up all kinds of metaphors now, but all these seeds you planted along the way are all going to blossom. And I feel like when I got to the end of the book, all of these things that I had been setting up through these different swimming motifs and metaphors and scenes, they all came together really nicely.
At one point in the story, Kofi's given a mahogany bodyboard. I wondered if there's evidence that those sorts of things existed as well.
They did. I mean, there was surfing back then. That's the thing. We don't know about it. And so I found that out. I discovered that was a thing back in West Africa. And again, conventional wisdom says if you're in the water and you're fishing and you're swimming, you're going, the curious mind, sort of the innovation that human beings have, you're going to figure out different things to do so that you aren't bored. So the idea of using some sort of material, some sort of wooden something or other to float on, to swim on, to use as a way of moving through the water, that's body surfing. And so these are actual things that happened that I tried to recreate.
I wanted to talk a little bit about writing in verse. When I read something like this, it feels condensed like a delicious jus in culinary terms.
It's the right words in the right order. I'm not telling you everything. I'm telling you very little. I'm showing you a lot in very few words. There's a lot of white space. There's some work that you'll need to do as the reader to fill in those blank spaces. I find that is exhilarating for a reader to go on that spiritual journey and find those answers and fill them in. You can write about really tough, challenging themes and topics with a poem and it still be palatable, I think. It's still something you can handle. It's like a cool drink of water in the spring. It's heart love. It's coming from the heart. And each word has been carefully chosen to make sure that A, you get the message, and B, you're not completely overwhelmed with it. And C, you do feel something from it, though. Feeling is the thing we're going after as poets. And so we don't need to have every word. We just need to have the right words in that right order. I love it. I've been doing it, all of my life. And so poetry is that tool for me.
I'm fascinated by the way the form plays with time. For me, it does two things. It speeds up time, so you move quickly through the story. But paradoxically, it does what poetry does so well and allows you to linger longer in the moment. I wondered if you would read the verse Hidden for us. This is where Kofi is in a tree. He's hidden and he's watching his sweetheart.
The tree we climb stands in perfect view of the stream where the girls dip their feet and play before filling their pots with water and carrying them atop their heads, each with one hand tightly holding it in place. Amma removes her hand from the rim to scratch her arm or slap a mosquito or something, does not put it back and still moves across the ground like a dancer, never spilling even a drop, her head still as the water it holds. When they get beneath our tree, she stops, and the other girls do too. You can come down now, she says, placing her pot on the ground and looking up straight at me.
And there we have it, one short moment that extends across 2 pages. Each line conjures its own vivid image, like a sequence of photographs. That those images can be planted in my brain with a few well-chosen words. It's magic.
Yeah, that's the power, my friend, of E.E. Cummings and Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot and Langston Hughes. That's what we do. We love it.
The Door of No Return deals with huge emotions. Shakespeare's referenced quite a lot, and it is Shakespearean in its scale. Guilt, revenge. The moments of revenge are heart-stopping. Tell us a little bit about that.
I read a lot of Shakespeare in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And I always used to wonder, well, why am I reading this? How's this going to impact my life? My daughter often asks me, why am I taking geometry? What does that have to do with my life? And so I made a conscious decision. I'm going to sort of use everything I learned in my readings of Shakespeare as a kid in this book. I'm going to make it worthwhile. How can I borrow from some of the themes of guilt and revenge and love? How can I take this idea of tragedy and let it take you a place where you weren't expecting it was going to take you? And then this idea that Shakespeare represents the utmost in the English language, like it represents the cream of the crop. Shakespearean dialogue and dialect and language and literature. When you talk about the English language, that is the thing. And so if you have this country that is on the verge of being colonized by England, and one of the ways that you colonize a people, or you take a people's culture away from them and consume them as a part of your culture, is you take away their language. You take away the thing that allows them to define who they are, to say who they are. You take away their language. That is the first major step in taking away a people's ability to think, act, say, be themselves. And so if we're going to replace your language with our language, then Shakespeare then becomes the metaphor for doing that. And so that became the identifier for this taking away one language and replacing it with another. So I was doing a whole lot of different things by choosing Shakespeare. I thought may work on different layers.
Most definitely. And ironically too, because Mr. Good Luck Philip, the English teacher, when he speaks, the poetry disappears.
Disappears, doesn't it?
Can we talk a little bit about Unspoken, which is the picture book that came out called An American Story in the States, but covering similar territory? Absolutely stunning imagery from Dare Coulter as well. Was it a project you conceived together? The synergy is amazing.
No, it wasn't. I wrote this quite a while ago for my daughter's class because there was an incident of racism that took place in her class where a white student asked two Black students to be her slaves. And the teacher didn't know how to respond to it. And so she just avoided it. At first, I was a bit upset with the teacher for that. And then I realized she avoided it, ignored it because she didn't know how to teach it. And I realized that quite a few teachers, educators, librarians, parents, we're afraid to teach slavery, or we don't know how to teach it. We're uninformed. And so that's where the impetus came from to write this book that could serve as an introduction, an entry point for those of us who are uninformed or afraid when it comes to the topic of slavery. And once I wrote it, my editor, Margaret Ramo, she found an illustrator, a young woman in North Carolina who she felt could do this book. And I had in mind somebody more accomplished. For instance, Kadir Nelson, who had illustrated The Undefeated. But I saw her work, I saw her sculptures, and I thought, well, she might be able to do it. And whenever I look at the book, I just say to myself, my words are really good, but her illustrations are a kind of brilliance that I don't think we've ever seen before in a children's book.
Every image in this book is visually arresting, but I was particularly struck by the image of the shackled wrists. And it really struck me looking at that when you turn the page the other way up, what you end up with is a Black Power salute. I think it's amazing.
Right.
I don't know whether that's conscious or not, but it's amazing.
Yeah, we talked about that on our book tour. She gave a lot of thought about each illustration. And like I try to write in layers and have, meanings in the white space, she tried to do something similar with her art. And so I find that really kind of exciting that, like you said, you can turn it upside down and it's a different kind of image. And even if you turn to the next page, you notice that there are children's hands being held up like they want to say something. And instead of the fist being clenched, the hands are open. The juxtaposition of fingers clenched together, and on one page, chained together, and on the next page, hands open, unchained, and fingers unclenched. So many different things she went into. And I think that's what makes a really dynamic illustrator, is when you can take the words and you create a whole nother narrative with the artwork.
And of course, the other thing that both of you are doing in that book, you intersperse the history with a contemporary teacher doing exactly what you might hope your daughter's teacher would do, try to find a way to deal with this. There are different schools of thought as to whether the topic of slavery is an appropriate subject for primary schools. Both sides have convincing arguments that put the interests of children at the centre. Those that argue for teaching about slavery would say that we can't bring children up in ignorance. And those that argue against are concerned about fueling a negative self-image before children are able to process this difficult subject. And I have to say that I've witnessed well-meaning lessons that have done exactly that. So I'm really interested to have your viewpoint.
I think kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And I think that if kids know that they aren't enslaved, kids know that they aren't slavers, like on a real just basic level, kids understand right and wrong. And so what is the problem with sharing with our children our history, things that have happened, so that they can empathize, so that they can understand, so that they can acknowledge all the things that as adults we're afraid to do. Let's create a world where our children are exposed to truth, no matter how hard it is. Because ultimately, if we want our children to be better than we are, then they've got to understand some of the things that have happened in our world so that they don't repeat those same things.
And it has to be said that the picture book, Unspoken, is a story of tremendous dignity. The image of the girl on the front cover, having her chin tilted so her head is lifted high, reminded me of a statement made by one of the politicians at the Full Circle Festival in Ghana in the year of return. The significance of that word does not escape me. He said, "We are not descendants of slaves. We are descendants of survivors."
Wow. It can't be better said than that. They're descendants of survivors of slavery. Oh, wow. That's powerful. It's so true. Reminds me of a Langston Hughes poem. I've been scarred and battered. My hopes the wind done shattered. Snow has frizzed me, sun has baked me. I think between them they done tried to make me stop laughing, stop loving, stop living. But I don't care. I'm still here.
No denying it. Poetry does it best. Well, I wish we had longer, but our time is coming to an end. So my last question really is about the fact that I know this is going to be a trilogy. So for books 2 and 3, are we staying in the same time with the same characters in the same place? What's going to happen? What can you tell me?
You know just the question to ask, don't you? So I will tell you this. Some of the questions that I left unanswered will be answered.
I can live with that because I know I've got another book to look forward to, and that's all I need to know.
Right. It's going to be very different, though. One of the things that I found extremely challenging about writing both of these books was the amount of sadness that I had while I was writing it. And it was hard. I would have to stop working on Door of No Return and go for a walk in Regent's Park. I just couldn't do it. It was too much. And so I know I don't want to go back down that path again. This was the darkest book I've ever written. The next book is going to be a little bit less painful, just because it's hard to stay in that space.
but we have to go down there in order to come up.
It's true.
Kwame, it's been a privilege talking to you.
Thank you for having me.